Hi, in our previous tutorial we did all the groundwork required to configure a project to use Hibernate. We created a new project, we added the Hibernate library and we added the JDBC library. So now we are all set to write code that uses Hibernate. Now before we start, let's look at what we would need to do in order to save an object to the database if we were not using Hibernate, because this is the scenario we're going to code in this tutorial. We're going to take an object and we'll use Hibernate to save that object to the database. Now what would we need to do if we were not using Hibernate in order to save an object to the database? Assuming we are starting from the scratch, we don't have anything in place, and except for what we did in our previous tutorial, which is we included all the required jars and we have a project. Now if we are starting from the scratch, what would we have to do if we're just using JDBC drivers? First, we will have to do the JDBC configuration. We need to tell JDBC which database we are actually interested in. We need to give the IP, the port number, the user ID, password. So this kind of configuration has to be done for the JDBC to allow it to connect to the database. Okay, next we need to write the model object, which is the object that we want to save. Let's take an example user object. This is the example that we took earlier. In order to save the user object, first we need to have the object in place. We need to write the class. So this needs to be done. Next, we need to have a service method that instantiates this model object. We need some method which provides the values to the object and creates an object in the first place, which is required to be saved. The next step is the database design. Now I have a user object and I need to save it to the database. Before I write code to save, I will need to have a table in place in my database which holds this user object. So depending on the fields that I want to save, I will have to create the tables and have the corresponding columns so that I can save the object data into that table. The next step is to actually write the DAO layer. We need to write code, which is a method which takes this object and it generates the SQL queries. It uses the JDBC connection and it creates a connection. It runs the query and it inserts the data to the database. So these are, at a high level, the steps required in order to save an object to the database if we were not using Hibernate. Now let's see how Hibernate changes the whole picture. First of all, the JDBC database configuration, yes, this is still required even if we're using Hibernate, because no matter what framework you would use, you would still need to tell that framework what the database is. There's no way the framework can automatically find it out. So we need to tell Hibernate what database we are interested in, what database Hibernate needs to connect to in order to save the data. So this is done in Hibernate by using the Hibernate configuration file. It's an XML file that we will write, and this will give information to Hibernate as to what database it needs to connect to. Secondly, the model object. We will need to have a model object because Hibernate needs to know what object it needs to save. And we will have a model object and we will configure it in such a way that Hibernate knows what needs to be saved and how. So this is again something that will, it'll be more clear when we start writing the code, but yes, the model object needs to be written, and we will configure Hibernate to get data out of this model object by using annotations. The third step which we saw is the service method. So the service method will have an instance of the model object, and normally what it would do is it would pass the model object to a data layer which uses JDBC. Instead, in the Hibernate way of doing things, the service method would pass the object to Hibernate APIs. The method would use Hibernate APIs directly, or pass it on to a data layer which uses Hibernate APIs. So it's actually the Hibernate APIs which do the save of the model object. Database design, it's not needed. We'll have a look at how this is done. You don't really have to create a table for every object. As long as you configure the model object the right way, Hibernate creates the tables itself. And finally, the last point, which is creating the data layer, where you map the object to queries. This is the biggest challenge when it comes to writing data layer code for converting objects into a relational model. So this major step is actually not needed when we're using Hibernate. As I mentioned here, the service method directly calls the Hibernate APIs, and the Hibernate APIs take care of saving the object. We don't have to write this DAO method where we take the objects, pull it apart, write SQL queries, execute them. All that is totally bypassed when we're using Hibernate. So to summarize, what are the things we need to do? First, we need to write the Hibernate configuration in order to provide the database details and other configuration to control the way Hibernate works. The second step, we need to write the model object, and we'll be using annotations to configure the model object so that Hibernate knows where to save the model object. Third, we need a service method which uses Hibernate in order to save the model object. So our service method will probably be a simple class with a main method. We will instantiate some test objects of the model that we have written, and we will use a Hibernate API to save those objects. And these two steps can be easily skipped. So let's start coding. The first of the three steps is to write the Hibernate configuration file. So I'll right click, new file. I will call this configuration file as hibernate.cfg.xml. So this is the default name for the Hibernate configuration file. If you stick to this name, then you would not need to specify anything to Hibernate. But say you're using a different configuration file, then you would have to pass the configuration file name so that Hibernate knows where the configurations are. The easier way is to just stick to the default so that Hibernate searches for this file, finds it, and then looks up the configuration details. I will save this Hibernate configuration file in the src folder. I'll say finish.